Now, what we're talking about today is with the grain. And what it's about is it's about designing, uh, utilizing wood grain in your pieces. So many times I'll see pieces that are beautifully constructed, nicely designed, but the builder hasn't spent a lot of time dealing with wood grain. And what we end up with is unfortunate combinations of wood grain. And aesthetically, it's a big deal. Oh, excuse me. Aesthetically, it's a big deal, but sometimes structurally, it's a big deal too. So I call this with the grain, making wood grain work for you and not against you. And believe me, some of my early pieces were utter failures as far as grain direction and grain continuity. But what I'm using in this is I'm using a door, simply because excuse me a second here. I'd like to get rid of that icon I've got on the bottom. Anyway, um, we basically build boxes. Tables are boxes without part of the box on the bottom, or filler in between the legs. Chairs are boxes. So most of the principles we're going to talk about as far as grain alignment and use of grain are going to transfer from a rectangular door to anything we build. But I use this to give you really good ideas of what to do and what not to do, and how a little bit of uh, change in grain patterns can make such a huge difference. Now, this door it's made from red elm, one of my favorite woods to work with. Unfortunately, somewhat hard to find. The Dutch elm disease pretty well wiped out all the big red elms through the Midwest. But I have a little stash of my own, and I seem to run across it every now and then. Red elm is kind of a combination of red oak and ash, and beautiful wood, beautiful light brown color, and really nice to work with. But it also has fairly demonstrative grain. It's an open grain wood, and this door is pretty pathetic. I made this door to be kind of the extreme of everything wrong that we do when we sometimes don't pay attention. We've got several types of wood in there. We've got rift sawn and flat sawn, and I'll explain what those are and where they come from. The left hand side and the bottom, the left hand style and the bottom rail are rift sawn. The rest of it is flat sawn. But it's really unfortunate in that we have a panel with big cathedrals in it, very demonstrative laminate, but it's off centered. And so it really throws the balance of the door off. The right hand style is just pathetic with that really strange grain, and then it runs off on the corner. And the top, we're only catching part of a cathedral, so not real nice. Now, this next door is a lot better. It's got rifts on the right style, left style, the top rail. The cathedrals in the door are a little bit better aligned, although one is short and one is tall. There's a little difference there as far as the light and the dark. And the bottom with the flat sawn in there, slowly working its way towards rift sawn, is acceptable. This is a better door, except for that right hand style. Again, flat sawn, fairly demonstrative. The bottom is okay. It would work. The panel is fine. It's basically a rift center working its way to flat sawn. Now, this is the kind of door that we really start to look for. It's got a nice panel that is flat sawn, moving to rift sawn on the outside, with that big cathedral, flame cathedral centered. It's rift sawn on all of the both rails and both styles. But even though this door is pretty nice, if you look on the right hand corner, lower corner, there is grain that runs off the edge. And that's kind of unfortunate because it makes the door feel like it's kind of tipping in that direction. It's those little considerations of grain that can make such a huge difference in how a piece looks. In the panel itself, there's a little bit of an inconsideration in that there is a tiny bit of sapwood that runs along that edge that leaves a white stripe up there. You can see it mirrored a little bit on the other side, It's, I guess, not actually sapwood. It's just a much lighter grain. Now that's something I can take care of when I'm finishing because I tend to stain or dye my pieces. I tend to color them, and I can blend that in very, very easily. But if I were just doing a natural finish, I wouldn't want that there. Now, the reason that grain tipped away a little bit at the bottom is that this was one of a pair of doors. Uh, Now, if you notice that the rails on the top and the bottom, the grain is riffs on and it goes continuously through. Those rails, top and bottom, were actually out of one board that was ripped down the center, more or less, and chopped for length and utilized so that you have continuous grain running through them. And you'll also notice on this, just not so much this isn't about grain, but it's about proportion, that my top rail is narrower than my bottom rail. Bottom rail is a quarter of an inch wider. The reason being is that things tend to diminish as they get closer to the ground. And if I put the same width rails, top and bottom, that bottom rail will always look narrower. We see that all the time in the cabinet industry and the furniture industry simply because it makes it a lot easier to construct doors, to construct a lot of things because there isn't a top and bottom. They don't pay attention to the grain necessarily. And so they can build a door a lot easier. They don't have to be as fussy about grain. But the reason that that door has that little corner that tips in is because that was one board that was split down the middle for the center two stiles. And it worked out pretty well. Now, these doors I built just exactly for this purpose because I wanted to show some of the things we can run into. Now, that middle stile split right down the middle, but the grain doesn't match up exactly. You don't see that as one board. The reason being is that the right-hand side of it got a couple extra passes in the planer, and it went down a little bit lower into the board, revealing a slightly different grain pattern. So the grain pattern doesn't run consistently through. That's something that's very, very important also when we're working with something. If we have matched pieces, we always have to make sure that we take the same amount of material off the face side of both boards while we're dimensioning it. I always put marks which side is going to be the face side. And if I get confused, if I get lost during the process and can't remember exactly what I've done, I just take a look at the end grain on the board, match it back up. In other words, if I've split a board in two, I can put those boards back together and I can take a look at that end grain. And if that end grain doesn't exactly match up, if it's just a little bit off, I can plane a little more off the thicker or the board that needs to be reduced to the other one so I can match those grains back up again. It's really important. I mean, it's these little details, these little considerations that make such a huge difference in how our pieces turn out. Now, an example of what a little difference can do is those two center panels. They're solid wood, quarter-inch thick panels. That was resawn out of one board. And you can see the difference in that cathedral in the middle, that flame cathedral. They're similar, but far from being exact. And if you were to fold them together, it's a book match. If you were going to fold them together, the only difference between those two boards when they're folded together as a book, the only difference is a bandsaw kerf and a light pass on the planer. But it made a huge difference in how they looked because, of course, they're coming out of a slightly different part of the board. All right, now let's talk about what I've been talking about, riffs on and flats on, and where it comes out of the tree and its dimensional stability, how it moves around, and what the benefits of these different boards are and detriments. Uh, when we saw a log, typically the sawyers these days just saw through and through. They start on one edge of the board, they'll square it up, make a cant out of it, and then just slab pieces off of it. Many, many years ago, of course, people would pay very close attention to where their boards were coming out of a log. The Japanese woodworker Toshio Odate, when he works on some of his high-end work, he will buy a log from the sawyer, and then he'll spend several hours mapping out on the end of that log what boards he expects to get out of that log. And he's doing it all by analyzing the end grain, because the end grain tells us what we're looking at or going to be looking at with boards. I can take a look at the end of a log and I can tell you pretty much what the face of those boards would look like as they came out of that log without ever opening it up. And that's what Odate does with his. Now, most of us don't have that ability to lay out what we're going to take out of a log. We're stuck with buying lumber from maybe a big box store for your lumber, or a lumber yard. If you're fortunate, you might know a sawyer who saws his own logs and hopefully has a kiln. We've got two in our area that are just great. One guy can saw up to, what is it, 6 foot wide boards. He's kind of specializing in really wide plank stuff, and he has a kiln. He can dry it. And the benefit to that is you could buy a whole flitch. You could buy an entire log that's been sawn through and through. There's real benefits in that the annual rings spacing is all the same, a real criteria for picking wood for your projects. And another one is that the color is going to be uniform throughout. So, okay, now what do we have when we saw a log? The piece right through the middle is called quarter sawn. And actually, if you saw a log right smack through the pith in the middle, you won't get true quarter sawn off it, or the best quarter sawn. You'll get rift sawn, because the grain is not going 90 degrees to the face. A good sawyer will saw on either side of the pith so that the annual rings are 90 degrees to the face of the board. This gives you your most dimensionally stable wood, because the boards shrink towards the outside of the tree, as a lot of people say. What I like to say is it shrinks along the annual rings. So if you have, say, a flat sawn board down on the bottom, one side of the board is going to have the real long annual rings of the smiley face or the frowny face, whatever, and the other edge of the board will have the real short rings. Well, if you lose 10% volume of that board as it dries, the long annual ring is going to shrink 10%. The short annual ring will shrink 10%. And you can see what happens when you have 10 inches and it shrinks 10%, that's losing an inch. If you have 2 inches and it shrinks 10%, you're losing hardly anything. So that bottom board would cup up. It would turn itself into a smile, which you would probably frown at. Sorry. But quarter sawn won't do that because it shrinks evenly along all of the annual rings. It only shrinks slightly as far as thickness goes. It doesn't shrink nearly as much on width, and it stays flat. It's very dimensionally stable. It's the reason the quarter sawn is often found in pieces like tabletops, pieces that you want to have very, very dimensionally stable. Quarter sawn will be the way to go. Years ago, we used to be able to buy plywood, and it was lumber core plywood is what it was. It had solid lumber in it, and I loved the stuff because it was usually pine or poplar for the core, and then it would have your veneers on the outside of it, and it was really nice to work, and it was lightweight. It was easy to move around, easy to work with, and it was very dimensionally stable because the core was made up of quarter sawn wood with veneers over the top of it. Well, that's been replaced by multiple layer veneers, and you don't have to worry as much about quarter sawn or flat sawn or anything with those. They just are alternate strands going different ways, and they create their own stability. But in solid wood, quarter sawn is the most stable wood. Next up is rift sawn on the right-hand side. Rift sawn is where the grain is, technically they call it 65, 90 degrees. I consider it 45 degrees to 90 degrees is your rift sawn wood, where your annual rings are diagonal to the face. And again, the wood shrinks along the annual rings. So this is a pretty dimensionally stable wood. You can get a little twist and wind sometimes out of a rift sawn board, but what it tends to do is it becomes a parallelogram. Just very slightly becomes parallelogram. And it Works well for tabletops, for big panels. Where it really shines is for things like table legs, corners on pieces, because Riffsawn has this wonderful feature that the grain faces are the same on all four sides. With quarter sawn, we have that quarter sawn face with the medullary rays and the ray flecks, and with white oak, it's all those big, beautiful ray flecks that we see. Um, but the edge of the grain is regular flat sawn boards, so it has a much different grain pattern than the face. Where rift sawn, because the annual rings are 45 degrees to the face, all four faces are the same. So for cabinets where you have a leg extending to the floor, and you can see that leg through the piece from both sides, or a table where you're going to have a view of both sides of the leg, Riffsawn is the ultimate because it looks the same. And I see that time after time where people will make a table and they use flat sawn wood for the legs, and the face is, well, one side is quarter sawn and the other side is flat sawn, two demonstratively different patterns, and it doesn't look good. And I've seen them where they haven't lined them up. They'll have one corner facing you that's quarter sawn and one that's flat sawn, and it goes on around the table, and it really is off-putting. It doesn't look good, even in a tightly grained wood like maple, where it's not tremendously obvious. It looks wrong. If you're not a wood technology person, if you haven't spent a lot of time really looking at wood and analyzing it, even though something like maple has a very tight pattern and it's quarter sawn versus its face sawn, you will still know there's something wrong. It doesn't work right. But rift sawn is one of my favorite woods because it's very straight grained, very clean, nothing demonstrative about it. It doesn't have the big ray flecks of quarter sawn. It doesn't have the big cathedrals of flat sawn. It's just really nice wood to utilize. Couple of decades ago, I made a fireplace mantle for a trophy room for animal trophies. And the fireplace mantle was 14 feet high and 17 feet long. And we had turn fluted columns on it. And it was a fun project. What was interesting is I didn't know really what the project was going to be until I put it all together, because I didn't have a place big enough to assemble it before I got it to the job site. So I built everything modular in my shop and prayed. But it was all done with riffsawn red oak. And it took a long time to accumulate enough riffsawn to do that. Several months of badgering the local millwork company to pull riffsawn for me, and our local hardwood lumber yard to try to get all the riffsawn they could. But what was fun is there were a lot of people who understood wood, knew their wood pretty well, and they couldn't identify what that wood was when they would walk into the room because it didn't look like red oak, not your traditional red oak. Tight grained, just gorgeous piece. And I really do like working with riffsawn. And on the edge of, where do you find riffsawn? On the edge of every wide flat sawn board, because as those annual rings move out towards the edge of the board, they change their direction. And if you look at that flat sawn piece on the bottom, the last couple of inches on either side would be rift sawn. And when you find wide lumber that's sawn towards the more towards the center of the tree, you'll find a lot of rift sawn on the edges. That's where I get most of my rift sawn. Is I go to the flat sawn bin. They don't typically, lumber yards don't pull the rift sawn. They do pull and segregate the quarter sawn because they know they can get a premium price. But the rift sawn's just the edge of wide boards. So I would go in and look for wide boards that I could cut the rift sawn out and maybe only have a couple inches of flat sawn in the middle, just like these panels right here. If you notice, that's flat sawn down the middle. It's rift sawn on either side, and those are rift sawn frames. So if we look back at this first panel, what a difference between flat sawn on the right and top and rift sawn on the left and bottom. And that's what happens with rift sawn, is you get that beautiful grain. Now flat sawn, that's our least dimensionally stable board. It's our most demonstrative because it has the big cathedrals that we like to see in wood, but it is very, very unstable. And during drying, it's going to cup and move around. You can plane it off, but you can plane it flat, get it four square, but it will tend to be a more reactive wood through moisture changes than rift sawn or quarter sawn, and it can cause you some problems. Now, we're going to talk about equilibrium moisture content in a little bit, and that's really important for stabilizing your wood. So that's a big part of what you can do to overcome problems with um, unstable wood. And again, here's a little graphic of shrinkage along the annual rings or towards the outside of the tree. Here again, quarter sawn, can't cup or warp. And when we're talking about flat sawn boards, wide boards, people will tend to rip them into smaller pieces, trying to avoid some of the uh, tendency for them to cup. And that is something you can do, is a wide board like this, rip it into three pieces, flip the middle piece upside down and glue it back together. Now, of course, you're going to have a vastly different face to that board. So if you had big cathedrals on it that you wanted to save, this wouldn't work very well. Where this will work is if you are trying to get a panel that will remain flat and you aren't terribly concerned about those cathedrals. Say you're making it out of maple, where the cathedrals aren't a big factor in the face of the board because the grain patterns are much more subdued. This would be a way that you could take and make a wide board stabilized that is flat sawn. Again, when you rip it into pieces, you're going to have rift sawn, flat sawn, rift sawn. Flip that upside down, and those rift sawn are going to stay somewhat secure, and the middle board will balance it out a little bit. Okay, now I talked before about judging what I see on the face of the board by what I see on the end grain. And this is how I pick my lumber when I'm going to a pile, is I look at the end grain of the board, because there's vast differences that are easily recognized from the end grain. On my wood piles that I have here at my shop and out in my barn, I always trim one end of the board clean, and that's the end that I'll have visible in my wood rack, so that I can see what that grain pattern is. When I go to a lumber yard to buy lumber, I bring along a low angle block plane, and I ask if I can trim a little bit of the wood off the end of the board, especially if they've been painted, so that they don't have end checking during the drying process. By the time they get to a lumber yard, that's not a real important consideration anymore. The wood has been dried. So most lumber yards have no problem with you trimming a little bit off, and you don't have to scrub all the paint off the end. All you have to do is make a couple light passes just to clean it up enough so that you know you're looking at annual rings rather than crosscut saw marks, which has fooled me more than a few times. You see these marks and you go, wow, that looks like a rift sawn board. It's got really nice consistent spacing. And then you trim it a little bit and go, oh, that's the circle saw marks that are left, or the bandsaw crosscut, whatever. So the difference, okay, the board on the left is a board that grew in a very good environment, had a lot of moisture, had a lot of sun, it grew fast, and it has wide spaced annual rings. When you turn that into a board, each one of those annual rings represents a cathedral that you're going to see on the face of the board. So you're going to have these big cathedrals with a lot of annual wood in between those annual rings, and it's going to be lighter colored for the species of wood. It's going to have a less demonstrative figure. The board on the right hand is what some people call old growth. It grew in an area where it grew slower. It had maybe it was in a real shaded area in the middle of a woods or on the north side of a slope somewhere. And so it has tight, compact annual rings. There again, when you make that into a board, it's going to have many, many cathedrals, all those annual rings a lot closer. And you can see, obviously, the denser board, the one that grew in a tougher environment, is going to be a darker colored board simply because it's going to have all of those annual rings, all of those cathedrals. The annual rings typically are darker than the surrounding wood, except for things like maple, where the annual rings are darker. In softwoods, we find sometimes the annual rings are lighter colored, but it makes a demonstrative difference. So when I'm looking at lumber, that's the first thing I look at is I know that I need so much flat sawn. I know I need so much rift sawn. So I'm looking through these boards, but the really important part is to look at the annual ring spacing. And that's how I start choosing my lumber. Whoops, going the wrong way here. So, this is my lumber rack here in the shop over in the corner back here. And what I do with my lumber when I stack it in there, and I do try to keep it this clean. My lumber rack got into pretty bad shape for a couple of years, and one of the things with coronavirus is I've gone through a lot of stuff in my shop. Last early spring, right after the shows were closed down for the year, I pulled my lumber rack completely apart, went through everything, and restacked it. But I've always done a thing where when I get the lumber, I take it to my radial arm saw. That's my main cutoff saw. Matter of fact, those little tabs that you see on the storage bins down underneath the stacked lumber, those little tabs are the outfeed table for my radial arm saw. You can see just the corner of my radial arm saw table. So I can easily cut the end of a 16-foot board over there. But I will take the boards, fresh into the shop, and I trim one end of the board so that I can see the annual ring. So use good quality blade, trim the annual ring, and then I mark down the length of the board and the species of the board and stack it away. And if say it's a cherry board that has beautiful grain, just really nice grain in it, I'll grade it. I'll put an A or an A plus. Um, Everything else is not an A or an A plus. I've only have select and better in there, so I'm not worried about knots or really egregious figures. The stuff out in my barn, I've got some number one common out there, and that I'm a little fussier with marking the grade on the ends. Those Some of them are trimmed off on the end, some of them I just mark the grade so that I know when I'm pulling lumber out there what I've got. But this is my stuff that I'm using in the shop on a day-to-day basis. And it is so nice if I need a piece of white oak that's 6 inches wide and I know roughly the annual rings that I want. I can look through that pile and there's my white oak pile. I can go up, I can look at the end grain, I can decide on what board I want to pull out of that pile. I still have to take the pile apart, but I know where I'm going. I take 5 or 6 boards off. I grab the board that I want. I stack everything back. I don't have to start finding places to lay all the lumber to compare the faces and take a look at it. I know what I'm looking for. I know what I've got up there, and I know the lengths and the species without scratching my head about it. As long as I've been doing this, I still have a hard time at a glance telling the difference in end grain between light colored cherry and maple. There's one that's pretty similar when you just look at the end grains. So it's nice to have everything labeled, easy to get through. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about balancing boards. We're going to go into design just a little bit here, and then we'll get back into continuing on with our grain. Now, these are some of the things that I talked about with some of those doors above, as we've got rails and stiles. And typically, if I'm building something, say this is two sides of a cabinet or the face of a cabinet or seat and skirt and cross members for a chair. I'm going to take one board and I'm going to split it in 4 pieces for my stiles. And I'm going to mark it with triangles so that I can keep them in order, know where they're going to go back together. Triangles are the ultimate way to mark your lumber in your shop because you can take those pieces, throw them all over the shop, pick them back up, and put them back together exactly the way you have it. When you're joining and planing, you can transfer those triangles to the edge. And then once you've got that face cleaned up, put them back together and mark the faces again. It's important. It makes it so much easier to work with. So my rails across there are one board that is ripped down the middle and chopped across. And that way I have continuous grain running across. If I have 5 doors or if I've got a long cabinet, my rails will be matched all the way across the top and all the way across the bottom. If I have multiple doors that I'm making and I've got my stiles, in other words, the upright pieces, I always make sure that the far left stile and the far right stile are out of one board. And then your rails run continuous top and bottom. The reason I do that is because we tend to scan the outside of an object before we look into the object. We look at the outline first. And if you scan a big object like that, you're going to see without really, you know, cerebralizing it, you're going to see that those two outside stiles match. They're going to have similar grain pattern, similar color. And then you're going to see the rails all the way through match. And that sets up the balance for those pieces. Um, those center stiles, if you want straight grain on there. Now, if I were to take one board and rip it into those four pieces, what I'm going to have is my left stile would be rift sawn. The center two pieces would be out of a flat sawn board, unless that whole board is rift sawn. It'd be hard to find one that wide. And then your right stile is rift sawn. So that center is going to be demonstrably different than the outside stiles. But since it's coming from the same board, it's going to have the same coloring, the same grain spacing, basically the same patterns. So it will work just fine with it. But it's important to keep track of your boards, lay everything out. Now here's a couple of, doors or face frames or cabinet pieces stacked. And here I've got the outside stiles out of one board, the middle stiles out of another board, not necessarily the same board, but the rails again, I try to keep out of one board. And something else on here that you'll notice is that I talked early on about the rails being different sizes, the upper rail narrower than the bottom rail, or the bottom rail thicker than the upper rail. And I do that on stack doors also. If you'll notice on that drawing, the bottom rail on the top door is thicker than the top rail on the bottom door. And it works out really well. When you open that door and the door is seen by itself, it's well balanced because it has that wider rail across the bottom. When you close it, it works really well with a narrower, slightly narrower rail below it, because you see that as one board and it's thicker than your top rail and it balances really well. And then I use a wider rail at the bottom. If I have really tall doors, I'll go significantly wider on that bottom rail just to accent it a little bit. If you're building something where you're getting close to the floor, wider rail on the bottom. All right, that's enough for design. Now we're going to get back to talking about grain. Now those doors were made out of red elm, and I went out and I grabbed a few boards of red elm out of the barn, brought them out, looked at them closely, and I had one of those really wonderful things where I had two boards that were sister boards. In other words, they came out of the log next to each other. And you can see the knot on the one board and the swirl from that knot on the other board. That's what I like to see. When I can find boards that have come off the sawmill side by side, those are the boards that I like to grab and put in my collection because I know they're going to work together really well. So those are the boards that I pulled out of this batch to make my pieces. You can see that on the outside edge, there's rift sawn. Down the center is flat sawn. As you can see, as it goes through the tree, the grain pattern changes quite a bit, but the grain spacing is the same. And the look of the boards is going to be very similar. Here again, you can see the two side by side. The one on the right has a little denser grain from where it came out of the log, or a little different grain pattern. So it has just a little different color. Now, early on, I talked about equilibrium moisture content, and that is so absolutely critical when you're building a piece. I bring my lumber into my shop at least a couple of weeks before I'm going to work with it. You notice that in my lumber pile, I have a pretty fair amount of lumber. And the reason that I have that lumber is that it is at equilibrium moisture content. So I can pull out of that pile and build immediately with it because it has found its moisture content according to the room. Equilibrium moisture content. What it is that every species of wood can hold a certain volume of water at a certain temperature and a certain relative humidity. As you move it into different temperatures and different humidities, it will change its moisture content. And if you have a board in the shop, like now in the middle of the winter, my shop is very, very dry. It gets down to about 15% humidity in the shop. So it's real dry. And that wood shrinks down about as far as it's going to shrink. White oak in a climate like this in my shop is probably at about 4 or 5% right now. It is bone dry. If I went out to my pole barn and grabbed a board out of there, it is probably at about 11 or 12%. So if I glued it up to, say, a 5% board and I had 11% board, there's 6% difference in that board. The wetter board is going to shrink as it reaches equilibrium moisture content. The drier board is going to expand when the moisture changes, and you are going to have stress in that joint forever. It doesn't go away. The boards will reach equilibrium moisture content after a while, but that joint will be stressed because one board shrunk next to the other board, and it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on that joint. And typically what you'll find is those laminations will fail. And a lot of times they'll fail right along the edge of the glue line because that's kind of the weakest point. And other times it'll fail a little ways in. So, but they will fail, and you get a lot of movement in that wood. So, equilibrium moisture content, really important. Moisture meters are really important to have in your shop. Now, when I'm checking for EMC on my boards, I don't even bother setting the gauge to whatever species I want. All I do is I grab my moisture meter and I go from board to board to see what the reading is. If the reading says 16%, I don't really care. I know that this wood is kiln dried. I know that it is in a stable environment. I'll go from board to board, and if they all say, 15.9 to 16.3 or whatever, I'm going to be happy with that, because that parts of 1% are not going to pose a problem. I just want to make sure that they're in the ballpark, that they've finished moving to acclimate themselves to the space, and then I'm off and running. And it's important. It's one of the reasons that when I start a project, I buy a lot of lumber, simply because I don't want to run short. First of all, I'm very fussy about picking my grain faces and patterns. And secondly, if I make an error, which I do, sometimes on a very regular basis, if I mess up a board, I don't want to have to be in a dead panic because I only had 4 extra board feet on a project that maybe is a total of 50 board feet, and I've got one board that's extra, and it grain pattern really doesn't match the board that I just messed up. So I'm going to have to go find a board that's going to work for this, which means that I'm going to find a board that has a different moisture content than everything else in the project. And if I go ahead and use it immediately, it can lead to some real problems with the piece. So when I make my cut list, my shopping list, I should say, I make a very tight cut list. I go through my plan. I determine what I want to have flats on, what I want for rifts on, where I want my quarters on, and then I go through and itemize all those pieces. I figure out how many board feet are in there, and I'll make myself a very concise list. In other words, I need maybe 30 or 40 board feet worth of excuse me a second, I just got distracted. 30 or 40 feet, 30 or 40 board feet of riffs on, maybe 50 board feet of flats on, and a little bit of quarter sawn. So then I'll put my list together, how many board feet of each species I need, and then I'll double it. And that's what I go shopping for. The reason I double it is because I want an excess of lumber. I want plenty of lumber to be able to work with. That way, when I do make a mistake or I do have a problem, that lumber is going to be very beneficial because I can pull from that lumber and use it right away on my project. I don't have to worry about it reaching EMC. And that is such a comforting thing. And people go, oh my goodness, that's a really expensive thing to have to double your lumber. Yes and no. I mean, it's always lumber that you're going to use. And you'd be surprised. I mean, back when I used to just do 25%, you can have close to 25% in cutting losses just in working around grain that really isn't acceptable for the project, or defects that you run across. So doubling it, it's not that big a deal. It really isn't. When you look at the greater scheme of things, lumber is one of our cheaper parts of doing this. When you look at what you have invested in tools, if you consider your time to be worthwhile, if you're doing this commercially, of course, that's lumber is really a fairly minor portion of the overhead of a shop. So buy plenty of lumber, get it in and let it equalize. Then I lay it out according to what I want to get out of the boards. And I see somebody is chatting me. Unfortunately, I can't reach it right now, so I'll have to answer those questions after we get through with the slides here. A little anomaly of this is that I can't have a split screen. But I'll go through and I'll lay out all the boards. I've got a bright lumber crayon, and I figure out what I want for my riff sawn, where I'm going to take it out of the board, where my flat sawn is going to be, cut around all the flaws, and I lay everything out. So I know exactly where I'm going to get my lumber from. And then I'm going to cross cut. Wherever I can cross cut, I'm going to cross cut those pieces, simply because I maximize the yield from my boards by cross cutting before I start to join and plane them. If I have a board that has a twist in it or has a bow in it, if I cut it into shorter pieces, that's a lot less of a twist or bow. And cupped wood is just nicer to work with if it's in shorter pieces. If I'm taking the riff sawn off the edge of a cupped board, well, then I'm taking most of the cup away from the board, or the extended ends of a cup. So I can rip these boards down, get them roughly to shape, then I'll join them and plane them. And again, if they are going to be boards that are going to be sistered together in the project, I'm going to make sure that I plane the same amount off both sides. And again, I can always check on it by putting the board back together and checking the annual rings to make sure that they are running one into the other. And that way I know that I'm going to be able to put those boards back together to make them look good. Another thing that I do is I check the grain direction. And I usually do that with a hand plane. You can look at the edge grain and you can get a pretty good idea of your grain direction, but sometimes it fools you. And when it's rough sawn like this, you can just run your hand over it and real quickly know what the grain direction is. But once you run it through a planer or over a jointer, sometimes it's a little hard to determine. So I take a hand plane, set it a very low cut, like a block plane or something, and I run it across the board. I want to know which direction that grain is going. Then I put a big arrow on it, which way the grain is going. I'll transfer that from piece to piece, so I always know what the grain is doing. A couple of reasons. One, I like hand planing bigger panels. It's a lot faster than a belt sander, and I don't have a wide belt sander anymore. When I had my commercial shop, I did. I loved the thing, but I don't have the room in my small shop. And another thing is when you are finishing the board, when I was doing this work early on in my career, one of the very first things that I made for furniture, I came into woodworking out of the restoration business. I had worked in a lumber yard as a kid, and I knew my way around finishes and paint strippers, things like that. And I bought some antique furniture for the first house that I had and restored it, and ended up starting a career as a restoration guy. And I'd build reproductions of pieces that people wanted. Tables were a big one. And I'd be very, very careful laying out the grain of my boards so that they look good. And I'd find that after I would have it all done and I'd start putting finish on, I had this striped effect, black and white, or two dark boards next to a light board. And I'd go, man, they looked really good when I had them together. Well, when I started hand planing boards, there was an epiphany. I realized what was going on with that. When I started hand planing boards, I found out that I would run against the grain on some of these boards. So I figured out real quick that I got to really make sure that all my grain is running in the same direction when I laminate those boards up. And that had the secondary benefit of eliminating most of those stripes. Because when we look at a board from opposite directions, they appear to be two different colors because of the chatoyance of the wood, or in other words, being able to see down into the wood grain. What happens is from one direction, you're looking at the backs of or the edge, the sides of the cell structure as it comes to the surface, because no board is perfectly parallel to its grain. You look at it from the other end and you're looking down into all the tubes that compose the grain. So one way absorbs a lot of light. The tubes, they tend to um, bounce that light all over, diffuse it, and you see that it's darker. And the other way, it refracts that light or reflects that light because it's a harder surface, and you see that as lighter. So when you have the grain direction running all the same way, even in things like legs on tables, make sure that the grain directions going in the same direction, so that all four legs or all three legs or however many are on the table have the same chatoyance, have that same look, so you don't have one leg that appears to be lighter or darker than the other legs. It's little things like that that can make such a huge difference in how our pieces turn out. And then also designing with the grain. This is an article from Fine Woodworking a number of years ago, and they talk about combining different types of wood. And that's always kind of a crapshoot. You can do things that, oh, that looks really good with a small sample, and then you do a whole cabinet's worth of it or a whole piece of furniture worth of it, and it doesn't look so good. These are some of the examples they have. Some of these I like, others I look at and go, no, there's no way I'd ever do that. I just don't care for the combination. So it's kind of beauty in the eye of the beholder. Oh, and there's my tractor. But um, it is fun to mess around with different types of wood, putting them side by side. And there's one on the right hand side, second down, red oak and white ash. I just don't understand why a person would really want to do that, but it works okay because ash and oak are fairly similar. But I would tend to, instead of differing in the species, I would differ in the cuts of the wood. In other words, rift sawn and flat sawn will give you a huge difference, but you still have that nice grayish white that ash has, and you're not introducing the pinkish tan that red oak has. And that can be sometimes off putting just because of the difference in color. So, okay, we're going to get out of this now, and I'm going to take a look and see what we've got. I'm going to get rid of my screen sharing here. Um, and let's see what we've got for any chats. Anybody have any questions about this? And again, I wish we could unmute and be live, but if somebody wants to try unmuting, please do. We can see if it would work or not. But if you have any questions, please feel free to hit the chat. And again, in your screen, you should have a button that says more down on the bottom, and click on that and you'll see a bar that says chat, people, and network on the top. And you can go up to the chat, click on that, and you can send a message if you'd like. So, well, I hope this worked out for you folks. From my end, all I see is a thumbnail of myself, and I'm talking. I have no idea about the quality that you're seeing or that you're hearing. I certainly would like to have some feedback on that from you folks who have attended the seminar. And my next seminar will be at 2:30, I believe, 3:30 Eastern time. And we're going to talk about sanding. So, oh, good. Well, thank you, Fred. Nice to know that you folks can hear me out there. And Kevin, thank you also. Martin, wonderful. Dennis, thanks. It's great to see you. Great to hear from you folks. What pieces would you tend to use rift sawn on? Dennis asks. I love rift sawn white oak. I love rift sawn red oak. I love rift sawn ash. Those are probably my favorites. Rift sawn maple, you really don't notice a whole big difference between rift sawn and flat sawn maple sometimes. Very similar. But the ring porous woods are the ones that are more demonstrative and more fun. Um, Anne, you may have mentioned this, but it's impossible to get copies of your slides. Thanks for the info. Well, Anne, this is being recorded as we're doing this, and it is going to be available throughout the day. You can go back and take a look at it. You can take screenshots of the slides. That would work just fine for you. And the videos that we're recording are going to be available for the next year. So you can go into, I don't know if you're going to go into Booth Central or the woodworking shows to access them. I'm sure that you can find information on that or request information. So yes, you have access to this for quite a while, which is something that I think is really cool. Fred, what thickness boards do you shoot for in making rift sawn legs? Um, Typically, my legs are going to be at least 1.25 inches square. Whenever I can find thick rift sawn red oak or white oak or ash, I grabbed it. I picked those boards up. If you looked in my barn, you'd see my addiction to wood. I have about 5,000 board feet out there that I can draw from. Some of it's just fairly common wood, but whenever I find something that's unusual, I snap it up. And again, I do have access to a couple of sawyers, one in particular that does a nice job of sawing, so I can buy lumber from him. And something that he isn't doing, and I wish he would, but it's probably more of a fact that we don't have a lot of huge timber around here anymore. Back in the 17 and 1800s in this country, we had amazing, 16, 17, and 1800s, we had amazing timber in this country, virgin timber. And the high-end furniture shops, typically on the East Coast, the furniture maker would align himself with a sawyer. He would find someone who was a timberman who would cut the timber and saw it up. They would typically go out into the woods, find a tree that the furniture maker wanted, and they would fell that tree. They would saw it through and through, and they would deliver it to his shop in a flitch. And in other words, the log was complete, sawn through and through. And of course, those sawyers are smart enough to know to cut a couple inches on either side of the pith so that you would have a true quarter sawn board through the middle. And the reason they call it quarter sawn is that you can get 4 true quarter sawn boards out of one log, excluding the pith. So in other words, like spokes on a wheel, you've got 4 quarter sawn boards. But the big thing is that all of those boards had the same grain patterns, the same color, and in getting the entire tree, you'd have everything you'd wanted. You had your rift sawn, your quarter sawn, and your flat sawn. So you could lay everything out and work from there. I'd like to have John, the sawyer that I've been dealing with some, I would like to have him find a really nice ash log and saw it through and through for me. I like working with ash, beautiful grained wood, and it's really nice. Okay, Dan, are all moisture meters about the same? Yes and no. I've got the latest moisture meter from, oh my goodness, the name escapes me right now. It shows equilibrium moisture content, which is really nice because it can read relative humidity immediately and temperature, and so it can deduce what your equilibrium moisture content should be for that board. Is that essential? No. If you get a reasonable moisture meter, and by reasonable, I'm saying something probably in the $100 range, you're going to have a meter that'll do everything that you want it to do. The cheaper ones, they're more for, the 30 buckers from some of these places. They're more for firewood. I've got one that I meter my firewood with, and once in a while I fool myself into thinking, well, I'll just go check to see what some of the lumber in my pile is, and it's undecipherable. It comes up with a reading, but it's not consistent. So buy a decent, Lignomat makes good meters. There are a lot of companies out there, and like I say, for around $100, you can get a good meter, and it's important. It's really important. When I go to a lumber yard, I'm bringing my moisture meter with me because I want to see what the readings on on the moisture of those boards are. It makes a difference. It just does. So, okay. Any other questions? Did I miss anybody? If I did, these kind of scroll up, and I can't seem to get at them once they've scrolled up. But if I missed a chat, please uh, reply again, and I will answer the question. But looks like we're getting close to our hour. I pulled that off, got it all done in an hour's time. And again, this is available. You can go back and look at this video again. I recorded it. It's available for you folks, and it will be available for up to a year. That's the benefit of buying in on these, is that you get all this information available to you for a year. It's really a great deal. I'm really thrilled about these virtual shows. I think that they have an awful lot going for them, and I hope that we keep them going for a long time. Okay, Dennis, when purchasing lumber, what moisture content are you looking for? Well, there again, that equilibrium moisture content comes into play. I usually ask the dealers if this wood has been dried down to 7%, 6 or 7%, or 8% sometime in its life. And a good lumber dealer will know if it's been quote unquote kiln dried. What that does is once it gets down to around 7 or 8%, there are some thick-walled cells in the wood that can really cause us problems. And the only way you get the moisture out of those cell walls is to aggressively dry the wood. It drives the moisture out of the cell wall, then the cell collapses, the lignin solidifies, and they won't take moisture back in. That's what kiln drying is all about, is collapsing those cells so your lumber is much more stable. When they dry wood in a steam kiln, they heat the wood to about 170 degrees, which drives the moisture out of it quickly. And to compensate for that rapid removal of moisture, they introduce steam in the kiln to keep the faces of the boards wet so that they don't check as they dry quickly. The problem with it is that it ruptures a lot of the cells because of the fast evacuation of water, and it weakens the board. Kiln dried wood that's been dried in a steam kiln or a typical commercial kiln has lost a lot of its structural integrity. I look for wood that's been air dried and then, preliminary air dry and then dried in a dehumidification kiln. That's your best wood. The moisture contents will be all over the map. When I'm buying wood in the summer, I'm buying some white oak in the middle of August, where it's been stored in an open building where ambient air is around. The moisture content can be up around 11 or 12%. That same board in the middle of the winter would be down maybe around 10%. If it were in a heated building, it could be as low as 4%. What I use the moisture meter for is seeing the consistency of the moisture. In other words, what the equilibrium moisture content is in the pile gives you an idea how long the pile has been there, if it's all stabilized and it's pretty much the same throughout. And I guess basically you have to trust your lumber dealer to guarantee that it was kiln dried, and then you're using that meter as a guide from there on out. There's nothing cast in stone about what the moisture content needs to be, other than it needs to reach equilibrium moisture content. And you can get charts for that. You can download those online, and what it'll do is you're going to take your relative humidity, you're going to take your immediate temperature, ambient temperature in the room, and you're going to put that into a formula that will, when you combine it with the specific gravity of your wood, is going to give you an equilibrium moisture content. It will give you a figure that your wood should be at for that temperature and that humidity. And that's what a good moisture meter will do. The one that I've got will take into account temperature and humidity and show me what my moisture content should be for that board. Okay, well, we've got through our hour, and I guess people will be off to other seminars. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I really hope that this has worked out. So please let me know if you have any comments, any suggestions. Please feel free to send me a chat. And let me know. And you can always contact me through rolandjohnson.com. That's my website. Don't pay any attention to the website. I haven't messed with that website in several years. It's not nice, but it's a good way to get a hold of me. You can just go into the contact me, and you'll have you can send me messages.